Hello, my name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're very pleased to do another series of interviews today as part of the AI and COVID-19 Disinformation Initiative. It's a project to look at the intersection of AI, COVID disinformation, and freedom of expression, a fundamental policy issue for many governments, NGOs, and the UN. And it's a project done in cooperation with the OSCE's Office for the Representative on Media Freedom. Today, we're very lucky to have with us a close friend of Migs. We have Isadora Hellegren, who's joining us from Sweden. Isadora is a policy specialist on freedom of expression and ICT at the Swedish International Development Agency. Isadora, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be here.
So Isadora, I'd like to start off first and generally ask you about what is your work on these issues of freedom of expression, artificial intelligence, and disinformation? How much does this occupy your time?
Well, it would be hard to give you an exact percentage, perhaps, on how much it occupies my time. Let's say it intersects with many of the issues that we are looking at, of course, and that it's intertwined in many of the challenges that we're seeing in the world around us today, especially in regards to the pandemic, in regards to how it affects populations all over the world, and other challenges that we're trying to meet, right? So it's there in different levels.
And wondering, Isadora, what are some of the key challenges that are raised by digital disinformation?
Well, there's a number of challenges, right? And the spread of disinformation, and especially at the scale that we see it today, it affects a number of human rights primarily. I mean, this is the perspective I'm coming from mostly, but it also causes very real harm to individuals and communities, society, and democratic governance at large. And so one of the biggest challenges, I would say, are, of course, to public health and the right to health. So access to up-to-date and accurate information is absolutely essential in tackling the spread of the pandemic. So inaccurate COVID-19 theories and misleading reporting on prevention or cures and emergency measures implemented by state or local authorities can encourage people to take more risks and perhaps then pose a threat to themselves or the health of others. False information claiming, for example, that, bleach could help cure someone from COVID-19 is directly dangerous, right? So disinformation regarding risks related to taking the vaccines might also deter people from taking decisions that would otherwise protect their and others' health. So we've seen such initiatives target specific demographics in society, often also already marginalized communities. And this was, for example, one reason to why it was difficult to tackle the Ebola virus in West Africa a couple of years ago. It undermines the resilience and the recovery and crisis responses of health authorities in general. But another key challenge is the right to free and fair elections. Access to accurate information, once again, is essential here before voting. It's one of the several key elements to meaningful participation in elections. And the scale of disinformation is now also in itself a key challenge. Disinformation, misinformation, false information, or fake news, all of these concepts are not new. However, the scale is unprecedented. And AI, which we will be talking about a bit as well, and machine learning, these tools are enabling this as they can exponentially increase the spread of the selected information online through different campaigns. There's this study from Carnegie Mellon that suggests, for example, that bots make up 45 to 60% of Twitter activity related to COVID-19, and they can automatically generate messages, advocate ideas, or follow other users and fake accounts to gain followers. So this is obviously also a problem, the massive scale. But lastly,
Sorry, please continue.
I just wanted to highlight that also the inappropriate policy responses to disinformation could also themselves obviously pose risks to human rights, in particular freedom of expression.
So you mentioned how and the Carnegie Mellon report that's showing that AI in some cases is being used to enable disinformation.
Right.
I'm wondering though, what is there a role for AI in addressing disinformation? Because I understand it's kind of complex. It can be used for both good and bad, but can it be used in a positive way?
Sure. Sure. I mean, AI is, we often think of it as this sci-fi thing, right? And it's not really, it's everywhere, and it's in so many of our solutions today as well. And it could be a part of the solution here. And if I remember correctly, there's also another study of this from Rand Corporation that stated that a computer model successfully could distinguish between tweets written by so-called trolls and tweets written by authentic political supporters during the 2016 US election by detecting a different use of linguistic patterns. So specific language tactics could be used to identify trolls in real time. And this is obviously very interesting. And such a tool could be used then by companies, private sector and public sector to counter online disinformation, and it could be very efficient. And if you use it to identify and to monitor instances of potential disinformation, this allows for then concentrating resources, human resources also, on instances where human oversight then is required. But I mean, there are still risks associated with this. If it applies, if you use it to apply it directly to, for example, content moderation and removal of content, you could be restricting freedom of expression or access to information by removing a lot of legitimate content. So it's still very, very important that any application of AI or other tools in this way comes with a great deal of transparency. How does it work? What criteria do we follow, and what are the results and the effects of this?
So I think you touched upon something very interesting, Isadora, about the issue of transparency for the big social media platforms and some of the dangers that if AI is brought out too quickly without thinking about it, it can have a real impact on human rights and freedom of expression. But I'd like to ask you what policies or measures are you seeing the tech platforms put out there to address misinformation around COVID? And are there any human rights concerns about what they're doing?
Right. So yes, a bunch of online platforms, especially last year, reported that they made adjustments to their policies to address the threats of COVID-19 disinformation. Right, and many of these measures were completely unprecedented. For example, they promoted accurate and authoritative information from WHO, national health authorities, and professional media outlets, while simultaneously demoting fact-checked false or misleading content, limiting ads that promote false products, and following their community standards then to remove content that could harm health or affect public safety. Facebook, for example, they took down a network of groups spreading disinformation. They disabled group recommendations. They banned political ads, and they built this large fact-checking network and focused actively on claims about the election, especially then during the US election 2020, including conspiracy theories. And Twitter, well, they started labeling content and stated that some claims were disputed, and eventually banned claims that would dispute election results, and even went so far as to banning the former president right from the platform. But what happened then is that misinformation dropped dramatically the week after Twitter banned Trump from their platform and some of his allies. But then again, a large number of people also moved to other platforms, such as Parler and others who would have no content moderation at all. But all of these were unprecedented measures for companies that had never actually banned disinformation of any kind prior to 2020. And of course, this has given rise to a number of other questions. Some have argued that the big platforms should have taken similar actions a long time ago. But since the tech companies have continuously sought not to claim this gatekeeper role, often referring to freedom of expression and their roles as platforms and not media companies as reasons not to, these actions also reveal how centralized these decisions were among a few select actors. So yeah, many of the current approaches in general to tackling disinformation through digital tech companies, they try to identify and remove all forms of information that are false and misleading, which inevitably also will end up removing other types of legitimate forms of expression. And there are also a number of examples how this have affected the activists and others around the world, so to speak.
So Isadora, I have the last question for you. You've answered everything very clearly and detailed. But I'm wondering, moving forward, what can governments do to protect freedom of expression in fighting disinformation? Is it looking at better regulation, like we're seeing coming out of Europe? Is it asking for more transparency from the big tech? Like, what are some of the pathways forward on this?
I would say it's all of those that you mentioned and more. First of all, perhaps instead of a legislative response, primarily, perhaps look into reducing the impacts of disinformation and ensure that there's a human rights-based approach to disinformation and content moderation. This means also considering if you consider policy or laws, for example, make sure then that these are in line with international human rights law and standards. Do these proposed policies, for example, restrict speech? How precise are formulations and do they have a legal basis? Because if they are vague or ambiguous formulations around, for example, false news, the scope is not precise, and this can very easily be misused, as there are also a number of examples of around the world. And are the responses to the addressed acts proportionate? Imprisonment and internet shutdowns might not be very proportionate responses to spreading disinformation or misinformation online. And also, speaking of the difference between disinformation and misinformation, also very important to differentiate between these different types of content. Illegal content versus harmful but not illegal content and the intention of spreading it. But that's the policy approach. I think also what we perhaps should be focusing more on is also the reduction of the impacts of disinformation, perhaps looking at supporting civil society actors, human rights defenders, independent media and journalism, and initiatives who are already working to counter the spread and impact of disinformation, such as independent fact-checking initiatives and other digital literacy programs, for example. It's very important to continue providing reliable and up-to-date information to people, and to strengthen digital resilience among people and civil society organizations, so that there is increased awareness and literacy and capacity building in general. But also, as I said, all of these suggestions and more, we need to continue supporting research. We need to understand what's going on and continuously evaluate to make sure that we're doing the right things in this battle, so to speak. And also advance the algorithmic transparency as well as transparency around funding related to advertising and political campaigning, say, particularly at election times. And and also mobilize all relevant actors, look at the collaborative efforts, and also, I would say, very important to support those efforts that are already there and make sure that they can continue doing what they are doing.
Well, Isadora, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise. You touched upon so many issues that are going to help us understand this and see what can be done, because this is a problem that's not going away. It's with us, and we've got to find ways to build capacity internationally and domestically. So thank you, Isadora. This is Isadora Hellegren from the Swedish International Development Agency. Isadora, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Kyle.